Marvel's Spider-Man 2 is quite possibly the best superhero game of the last decade. The first two games in the series were already top tier among superhero games, but this one somehow managed to build upon every aspect of those to make something even greater. From the traversal mechanics to the suits and the combat mechanics, and yes, even the boss fights. The first game definitely had good bosses per se, but none of them really stood out like they do in this game. You can tell they really put a lot of love into improving the mechanics of each boss, and especially the general atmosphere in each boss fight. I genuinely don't think there is a single bad boss in this game, which is why it makes it so hard to do what we set out to today. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the official Marvel Spider-Man 2 boss ranking on the ultimate difficulty. What's going on everyone, and welcome to the channel. We do a lot of gaming content here ranging from gameplay challenges to in-depth story and lore related videos, so if you're interested in that kind of thing, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any future content on the channel. For today's video, I will be ranking each main boss fight in Marvel's Spider-Man 2. Each one of these fights was done on the ultimate difficulty so that I could be sure to get the most in-depth experience with each one. This game has a total of 10 main boss fights, and as I said before, honestly, each one of them is very good. But as a ranking video goes, some are going to be better than others. With that, I am absolutely sure your guys' rankings will be different than mine, but let's keep it civil and just discuss it in the comments, okay? To start off, I do want to say I will not be ranking any of the semi-bosses in the game. By these, I mean like the MJ Behemoth boss fight, as well as some other brute enemies that have a boss health bar, but turn into regular enemies later on. Those are not pure bosses, so it's going to be the main 10 from the game for now. We will be scoring them against 3 categories. Mechanics, which will be for any of the combat or environmental mechanics incorporated into the fight. Atmosphere, which applies to the overall emotional aspect of the fight, as well as just how the arena itself just feels in the moment. And lastly, difficulty, as I think a proper difficult fight can really enhance a boss, but also an overly difficult fight can knock it down a bit. After that, we will average out the 3 for a total score on the boss, and any ties will just be settled on how I personally feel for the fight. Okay, you guys have waited through enough introduction. Let's get on with our bottom pick.
Well, you lived a good life, right? I'm only 10!
Coming in at number 10, I chose Mysterio. For the mechanics, I gave it a 5 out of 10, as there are some really cool aspects such as the cloning he does in the last phase and the fake out win where the game tricks you to thinking it's over. But overall, they just felt kind of bland to me. Like, they had some good surface level intrigue, but they don't really go much more in depth. Like, Mysterio is all about illusion and trickery, but they don't really push that limit when it comes to how he fights and such. What they do push it for, however, is the atmosphere, which is why I gave that a 7 out of 10. The first phase being in the snow globe with a gigantic version of him towering above just really sets the tone. And the second phase being played off of Coney Island where the storyline with him started was a nice full circle touch they did with him. They also nailed that general sense of feeling overwhelmed that Mysterio can bring with his illusions. From fighting off a bunch of enemies to a bunch of his clones, I think that they really nailed this fight's aesthetic, but what I really didn't feel they nailed, which is what my main complaint is the difficulty. The Mysterio boss fight takes place at a point in the game where it's roughly half to 3/4 of the way through the game by the time you finish all the Mysterios. Because of this, Miles is pretty equipped with a bunch of stuff that he can use that just really tips his scales in the fight. For one, you're already used to fighting a lot of enemies due to the general mechanics of the Mysterios themselves, but also he doesn't really have any attacks that are really hard to dodge or parry. I'm sure you could bomb rush all the Mysteriums the second you unlock them and therefore start this fight early, but bottom line is most people aren't going to do that. I think they could have balanced this a little better to later game Miles, but that doesn't mean that the fight was bad at all. It's still really enjoyable experience. With that, he averages out to around a 4.7 out of 10 and takes the bottom spot as the worst fight amongst 10 all really good fights. I really want to make that clear. Every fight in this game is really good and fun. Some are just obviously built with a little more love. But that leads us into our number 9 spot, which I decided to go with Wraith, the Yuri boss, as a part of the Flameside mission. This is a fight that they built up in the DLC for the first game, and we finally get to see how it pays off here, so let's start with the mechanics. For me, the mechanics also get another 5 out of 10. To start off, it's a simple one-on-one fight with no big flashy gimmicks, which I can appreciate for the context. Absolutely, Yuri isn't a superhero. She doesn't have any powers that really put her on that level of Spider-Man. This makes a lot of her attacks pretty simple but clean in execution, where she can fight up close or hang back with her whip if she needs to. But that's really all there is, a simple fight with clean execution. There isn't really anything that makes it stand out from the other fights on this list. Like with Venom, you have big symbiote attacks, or Kraven with his tools, and Mr. Negative with his powers. Here, it's just a normal human who's good at fighting. Like I said, it's not bad, it just doesn't really stand out. But what really didn't stand out to me was the atmosphere. For the atmosphere, I gave it a 2 out of 10. The start of the arena is extremely dull and nothing special. It's literally just a burning building from the current mission you just played. The parts where it does get some points is the little interactions with Yuri. She's obviously frustrated to have Spider-Man in her way, and Peter obviously can't let her just go around killing people, so it's cool to see that tension build, but it really falls off because you know neither one of them is going to kill each other. You know at the end of it they're just going to call it and let it go for the time, as they still have a bigger threat at hand, so the stakes for the fight itself don't really add up very much. What did add up for me though was the difficulty. This one I feel is a very personal, but I gave the difficulty an 8 out of 10. This is another side mission fight like Mysterio, but they placed it in the middle of the questline this time instead of at the end. This allows it to take place at a point in the game where you have some utility but haven't built anything up enough to overwhelm her yet. This is also technically the first fight in the game with the blue ring unparryable attack so long as you do it before the lizard, so it does introduce us to that fun new mechanic to us. There are a few attacks that I do feel a little cheap, but nothing overly frustrating or anything. Except for that f***ing whip attack. Again, it's a little personal, but I really struggled on this fight. Her attacks can be pretty hard to dodge or parry at some point, so it took me quite a bit to finish. Actually the longest on this list. It does, however, feel pretty rewarding when you do complete it though. With all that said, the fight averages out at a 5 out of 10 for me, taking the 9th spot on our list.
Pretty sure that makes 8. Never letting the boy live this one down.
So, for the next 3, I'll go ahead and say it. It was a 3-way tie on the scoring system, and I had to move them around to make the ranking, but honestly, depending on the day, I could feel a bit differently. So, it will probably piss a few people off when I say Sandman takes up number 8 on the list. It was honestly such an amazing boss to start off the game. I do think it was a perfect choice for the tutorial, but that's just where the fight gets hindered, is that it is a tutorial. To start off, let's get to the mechanics. I gave the mechanics a 7 out of 10 because honestly, it's so fun to do some of the things that you can do in this fight. You shoot Venom blasts at him, you web up his face and literally beat him with it, and even the little breaks where you fight his minions are really fun and pace very well. That's really where this shines. They knew what they were cooking when they decided to do a giant Sandman fight. They also really shined with that on the atmosphere, which I decided to go with an 8 out of 10. Again, this is a giant kaiju type Sandman fight. You start off with a normal day and get dragged into a citywide phenomenon against one of Spider-Man's most iconic villains. Like I said before, you're shooting Venom blasts, you're webbing up parts of him and beating with it. He's literally throwing you around the city. I just think they really nailed the scale at which this game was going to be right from the beginning. But like I said, it is a tutorial, and that's why it gets knocked down in the difficulty area. I gave the difficulty a 2 out of 10, and honestly, it's not the biggest deal as it is a tutorial fight, but because of that, it feels like they were really hindered on how in-depth that they could all go with it. This makes the fight pretty quick, especially on a second playthroughs where, therefore, you don't get that much time to just take it in and enjoy it. I feel like if Sandman was another fight somewhere in the mid-game, it could have been even better and close to the top of this list, honestly, as they wouldn't have been held back by making it all a tutorial for the combat. However, this fight was still amazing, and overall it gets a 5.7 out of 10, but this fight was so much fun, and like I said, as a tutorial, they really knocked it out of the park with the scale this game was about to get into.
You were seen by no less than 7 muggles.
Now, when it comes to a fun fight, number 7 probably could have been close to number 1. As for this placement, I'm going with Venom versus Kraven. I mean, you get to play as freaking Venom, how much cooler can you get than that? There aren't many more fights as fun to play as than this, which is why for mechanics I gave it an 8 out of 10. First off, the mechanics are really simple and easy, which is the only reason it loses 2 out of 10 points. But I mean, come on, it's Venom we're playing as. You're meant to feel like a beast the whole time in this fight. I honestly love it too, because throughout the game, Kraven has been a menace himself, but the second he's face to face with Venom, it's like he was never a challenge to begin with. From slamming symbiote powers, throwing back rockets, and just the sheer power you feel playing as this iconic villain really makes up what's so cool about this fight. For the atmosphere, I gave it a 6 out of 10. This is mainly due again to just how it feels to be playing as Venom. The fight takes place in Times Square, which isn't super meaningful, but at the same time, I can't really think of somewhere that would have fit the fight better. They just needed a nice open area to put the fight in so that it does work. Like, that first area you play as Venom has a really cool atmosphere because they're locking down the whole tower to keep you in. But Venom is so powerful, he doesn't even break a sweat getting out against everyone. So to put it simply, it has a good atmosphere, it just doesn't have anything that really makes it stand out. Lastly is the difficulty, which gets a 3 out of 10 for me. Now, I do think that this was done intentionally. I don't think they wanted this to be a particularly difficult fight so that it could represent just how powerful Venom really is. Because of that though, it doesn't have anything to really challenge the player as you're just flailing around with big bulky attacks until he dies. That works really well for the fun aspect, which is why the mechanics got such a high pointage for me, but the fight ends up going by pretty fast. Overall, that places the fight with another 5.7 out of 10. And like I said, this really could fluctuate depending on the day. This fight is very good, but for now, this is where it ends up on the list.
Okay, Mrs. Puff, what's my final score?
6.
Woo!
To finish off the three-way tie, number 6 is going to be the lizard fight. I know a lot of people aren't the biggest fans of the gigantic version of the lizard, myself included, but I do feel it worked for the context that they were going for. At this point in the game, it's the first main story boss that you have after obtaining the symbiote powers, and you can tell they wanted this fight to really show those off and how powerful the symbiote was going to be. To get started, the mechanics got a 7 out of 10 for me. Being able to use all the symbiote abilities for the first time properly against a boss is just so fun. Like, I love how they changed the symbiote grab and slam ability to just grab his face and slam it, since they knew it would look weird to actually pick the lizard up. At the same time, if you do this fight before the Wraith fight, then this is the first fight with the blue ring dodge only attack. Also, I believe this is the true fight where they wanted that shown off, because you actually get a little tutorial saying you can't parry it in this fight, but you didn't get one for Wraith. This is also the first fight in the game with true environmental effects on the fight, as when the lizard walks across the doors you can pull them open, blasting him off and stunning him for some combos. I really think this is where the bosses in the game just started to ramp up one after the other. For the atmosphere, I did end up going with a 4 out of 10. This is all mainly due to the interactions with Peter talking to Lizard, or Connors, whichever you want to call him, as it starts to show how bad the symbiote is affecting him. He's calling Connors weak and even throwing out his family, leaving him, which, like, whoa, Peter, way too far, but like, also, yes, or bully Peter more. The reason as to why the score is low though is just because of where it all takes place. To put it simply, the fight is just barreling through the city causing destruction, which isn't special. We've seen that before and doesn't offer much unique factor. And when you do actually one-on-one him, both of those places are just underground in like a weird facility type situation. It has absolutely no flair to it and kind of feels just bland. But you can tell that's not the aspect they wanted to focus on. They definitely wanted to start ramping up bosses and show how powerful the black suit was going to be. And finally, difficulty is going to get a 6 out of 10. This is where I thought the fight shined more than the Venom vs. Kraven fight. As I said in that one, they clearly dialed back on more in-depth attacks and parries to show how powerful Venom was. In this one, however, Lizard is actually a tough opponent. His timing for each attack is different from each other and makes parrying take a bit to get the hang of. And that blue ring attack I mentioned again was first revealed here and can be really hard to see coming sometimes. I just think this fight was more balanced overall, while still being able to show how powerful that black suit is. Overall, again, it ends up at a 5.7 out of 10. It's a very good fight, but ultimately I found others to be a little more enjoyable.
You'll need to know the context for this next number because it's number 5.
Kicking off our top 5 is going to be Scream, the MJ symbiote suit boss fight. Now this one was definitely a surprise. I know a lot of people weren't expecting Scream to be in the game, and while I don't think it was the best fight, I think it was absolutely a welcome surprise. The mechanics I gave a 7 out of 10. It basically just does everything I already love about the lizard fight. The timing across her attacks still vary, having you have to really pay attention and learn the timing. I also love the inclusion of the cars and metal pipes in the arena to cause a sonic sound to stun her. Also, kind of the opposite of the lizard fight where they focus on using those symbiote powers, at this point, Peter doesn't have a symbiote anymore, so I love how we get to focus on a lot of the other gadgets we built up along the way in the story, especially the spider arms. Because at the same time, this is the first big boss in the game where the spider arms really come into play. Like, technically you can use the arms throughout the whole game, even with the black suit, but I know at least for myself, I was just on such an adrenaline rush with the symbiote powers that I forgot the arms existed. So being able to have them front and center here felt really refreshing, because honestly, the spider arms can be just as fun to use. Now where I feel this fight really shines the most is the atmosphere. For the atmosphere, I also gave it a 7 out of 10. The main bump here is just that emotional back and forth between Peter and MJ. The symbiote allows her to let out some inner feelings that she had been keeping hidden, and it causes Peter to realize just how much him being Spider-Man affects her and their relationship as a whole. It also really hits how throughout the fight when MJ kind of breaks through a bit and begs Peter to help. It really hits hard and helps put together how serious this is. I love when developers can just make a moment really dark and serious while still allow you to really feel the emotion in it all. The only knocks I have for the atmosphere is the arena environment aren't that crazy. Like, it's just a suburbs area and I can appreciate it's right outside Peter's home, but it's still not unique enough to really give it anything. Lastly, for the difficulty, I gave it a 6 out of 10. I think it's pretty on par with the difficulty of the lizard fight, and honestly, if anything, it does get knocked a little down slightly due to pacing. I feel like the fight drags on just a little too long. Hell, she has 4 health bars, and the only other boss in the game with that much is Venom, who is the literal final boss of the game, and he's split between 2 characters, so that made sense there. I think just cutting 1 health bar would have done this fight very good, but honestly, it's really good as is, so I can't complain too much. Overall, it gets a 6.7 out of 10 and takes the 5th spot here on the list.
Number 4.
Getting into the real meat on the bones here now, our number 4 spot gets handed to the ultimate hunter, Kraven. This time it's with Peter, however, and I feel they really smashed it with how I expected Kraven to fight when they first announced him for the game. Now, if only you guys could just smash that like and subscribe button. Liking and subscribing is a great way to help grow the channel and spread it to a wider audience, so if you guys are interested, consider subscribing so you don't miss out on any future content. Any support is greatly appreciated. and maybe my wife will stop hunting me down to find another hobby. But speaking of hunters, back to Kraven. He's a hunter, and in a hunt, it's life or death, so he's willing to use anything and everything at his disposal, even when in the end he wants to lose. The man wants to die, and yet is still not holding back against it so he can be served with a proper death. Per usual, let's start off with the mechanics, which I gave an 8 out of 10. This fight has a lot of newer stuff added to it other than the last two entries, elaborating more on just a parry attack and a dodge attack. He decides to use everything that he has, throwing explodable spears, an axe that you can throw back at him, going invisible, sending robo-hounds on you, and even that bell in the second phase. I love the addition of an environmental effect that you have to keep track of. It never overwhelms you, but just adds a little bit of spice to the fight. It's just really cool to see that he still has those dodge and parry attacks other bosses have, but he added so much more onto it. Like, you really feel like you're being hunted in this fight, and that fits on brand for Kraven the Hunter. The atmosphere is also pretty good, getting a 6 out of 10 for me. Now, just to say it, all of this comes from the emotional feel of the fight. I don't really think the arena is anything special or adds much. It's just a hunter base. There isn't anything that adds flavor onto it. Like, with the Scream fight, it doesn't really have much either, but I could appreciate that little addition that it was outside of Peter's home. Here, it doesn't really have much going for it there. What it does have going for it is that emotional feel I mentioned. Just to start off with before the fight, Peter is pissed. He starts to blame everything on Kraven, even giving us that Venom voice saying that he's going to kill Kraven, which we all know is just not Peter at all. Then we get into the fight, and he taunts Peter with Miles, really pushing Peter's anger over the edge to a point of pure rage. And at the end of it all, Peter actually was going to kill Kraven and break his code, and if it wasn't for Miles, Peter would have dealt with that guilt for the rest of his life. It just gives the fight real stakes. Now finally, for the difficulty, I gave it a 7 out of 10. Absolutely a ramp up from the previous fights. Like I mentioned with the mechanics, they added so much more into this fight with all the tools he's able to use, and it absolutely makes it a more difficult challenge, but surprisingly never overwhelms the player at any point. It's not the hardest fight by any means, but it will require a bit of grinding to do. Overall, this totals out to a 7.3 out of 10, and allows us to move on into our top 3 fights.
I got you for 3 minutes.
Top 3 kicks off with Mr. Negative. I remember around this point in the game I was basically saying each fight was my new favorite, and this one definitely stuck with me for a good bit. Of course, it's not my favorite after letting it sit, but it's still absolutely one of my favorites. To start off, the lead up to this was intense, as throughout the game it was clearly teased that Miles was eventually going to face off against his father's killer, but we were all on edge as to how far Miles would go for his revenge. Of course, being Spider-Man, he doesn't kill him, and in fact helps him escape, but the fight itself throughout was not a disappointment at all. Let's hit the mechanics real quick. I gave the mechanics a 7 out of 10. It's a bit of a dial back from Kraven, as Kraven just had a lot more unique attacks, but it was all still very entertaining. The big flashing negatives on attacks are really fun to deal with, as they aren't too complicated, and the game isn't oversaturated with big flashy attacks, so it allows these a chance to stand out here. I also love how you're forced to use the evolved Venom abilities. Considering Mr. Negative is the one who sparked these in Miles, it's fun to have to use those back on him to progress parts of the fight. Also for me, the parry and dodge attacks timings just felt very smooth and clean. It felt it was a bit easier to catch on to personally, and yet still felt very rewarding to get off. Now for the atmosphere, I actually gave this one an 8 out of 10. As I mentioned, the game clearly built this up from the moment Mr. Negative escaped the raft, so we were already anticipating the upcoming showdown. Then to add to it, Miles is looking for Lee the entire game, and the one time he wasn't expecting him, he finally runs into him and is forced to participate in a death match, the one thing he was still struggling to decide on. The arena is also really cool, but nothing crazy, with everyone cheering on in the sidelines rooting for a death. And while that goes on, Miles and Lee are going back and forth with each other, debating on if they should really do it. It's an absolute tense situation and pays off when Miles ultimately lets Lee go and helps him get out. Finally, the difficulty, and this was no easy fight. I gave it a 7 out of 10, as I felt it was on the more difficult end of fights, but not something I found myself getting frustrated on. Having to wait on your Venom to recharge can be a pain and slow pacing a little, but once you're back in, it's one after the other. I don't really have much else crazy to say about the difficulty. It was just honestly that sweet spot for me that rides the line of a difficult experience, but never once makes me feel like I'm being cheated. Overall, the fight ends up at a 7.3 out of 10 and leaves us with just 2 remaining fights.
Okay, 2 copper pieces.
It's not as amusing the second time, boy.
So here it is, the finale closing in. But which one did I place our last 2 at? Well, drum roll please. Wait, what do you mean that's not in the budget? Our number 2 spot is going to be Venom, the final boss of the game. Now, when I speak of this fight, I do mainly refer to the Peter and Venom section. The Miles portion was also pretty good, but I felt like it was done better in the first half overall. It was honestly everything I wanted in a Venom boss fight. Venom is towering over Peter and just comes out as a menace to society from the moment he's introduced. I want to talk about so much, but let's keep it under their respective categories. Mechanics get an easy 8 out of 10. To start off, I love the forced movement across the arena in the first phase, where Venom will blast one of the 3 platforms, forcing you to move around. It allows you to get a grander sense of the arena instead of being locked into one small portion. Another new addition to specifically this boss that I enjoyed was the anti-Venom health bar, where Venom's health is blocked by a white bar that you need to use anti-Venom attacks to deplete it before you can actually start doing real health damage again. I just thought this was a brilliant way to prolong the fight a bit as Peter without being tedious and still making sense to the contacts. The Miles portion doesn't really have as much unique mechanics like these, but I did appreciate the balance of air and ground combat since Venom has wings in that fight. For the atmosphere, I went with a straight 9 out of 10. Again, most of this comes from the Peter and Venom portion, but Miles has good moments too. Both of the arenas for stars were great choices, having it be the school where Harry and Peter's friendship begins to the Emily May Foundation, the beginning of its end. It's sort of a full circle moment that I can really appreciate. Also, I'm a sucker for the symbiote takeover of the arena, as well as you'll see in the number 1 spot again. It really gives you that sense of how much of a threat Venom really is, that he can just encompass all around you. In keeping with the atmosphere, the banter between not only Peter and Harry, but also Miles too, is really emotional. The Peter portion definitely takes the spotlight as they're best friends, and the way Peter pleads for Harry to see reasons throughout the whole fight is really heart-wrenching. But even with Miles, they dug in a little deeper to the interactions of him and Harry. Obviously Venom hates Miles for ripping him and Peter away, but Miles was also jealous a bit of Harry coming back, the same way Harry was jealous that Peter and Miles had also become sort of best friends. It's just really cool to see opposing close friends of the main protagonist duke it out, and in the end, it's Miles who's able to somewhat bring Harry back when they thought that there was no other way he could survive. Of course, lastly, the difficulty, and I have about the same to say for this fight as I did for Mr. Negative, so it's also going to get a 7 out of 10. I just feel it's very balanced without feeling cheap at any point, and in correlation with the Scream fight, these both have 4 health bars, but the pacing was done better here so that it doesn't feel dragged on like the latter. I will say I think the Peter portion is more difficult as Miles just has a lot of utility to spam back to back, but they both killed me a few times on that ultimate difficulty, so in the end I had a very rewarding experience. Venom was an absolute menace to live up to, but I feel Insomniac did a really good take on the classic villain. Overall for me, it comes in at an 8 out of 10. It takes up the number 2 spot on our list. But there was just that one fight that really shined above all the others to me.
It was his hat, Mr. Krabs. He was number 1.
So the absolute best fight in Marvel Spider-Man 2, in my opinion, is the Miles vs. Peter fight. I mean, it's a Spider-Man vs. Spider-Man fight, something we all anticipated the moment we saw Peter got the black suit. The tension was built up so perfectly too, having a wedge slowly driven between the two throughout the course of the game. Peter starts to prioritize Harry and the symbiote, and Miles feels left out as he tries to find Lee. He ends up seeing all the changes Peter goes through and even tries to support him as much as he can, but realizes just as Peter is about to kill Kraven that he's gone too far and has to be stopped. But we can get into all that more when we get to Atmosphere. For now, let's talk about the mechanics. Mechanics for me got an easy 9 out of 10. For one, it's amazing to watch as Peter uses the very moves you unlocked and upgraded back at you as Miles. It almost feels like you're fighting yourself since you do play as both the heroes in this game. It also is a fight where both players feel equal in power and size to one another, making it feel pretty balanced overall first going into it. There are just so many little small things added that make this fight so enjoyable, from dodging and parrying the very moves you use as Peter, using the belt for offense this time instead of having to web it up, and even Peter dodging your moves with Spider Sense just like you do when you play as him. There's even a little small rare attack that I've seen where when you throw the Venom projectile he tosses at the bell, he will grab it and throw it back at you, making you have to react a second time. I haven't personally ran into that attack myself, but I've seen it, and it's small attacks like that that just add that little spice kick. It is genuinely just one of the most fun fights in this game to play in, but the atmosphere is somehow even better. I ended up giving out the first 10 out of 10 to atmosphere on this fight, and I think it's well deserving. I kind of went over the main of it at the beginning here, but just that feeling of fighting against the Spider-Man you also played as and learned to love. The feeling of Peter going too far and Miles taking on the responsibility to bring Peter back from the darkness. Also, the little breakthroughs that Peter has, saying how he needs the suit to be a good Spider-Man and feeling as he has no other option before Miles finally beats some sense into him to fight back enough and realize how far he's gone. You can also of course hear bits of Venom throughout the fight as well, just further showing how far Peter has fallen and how important it is for Miles to not lose here. It is the fight that genuinely makes you feel the most emotion and sense of urgency to accomplish. Also, we're not going to skip over that Goku Kamehameha reference there in Insomniac. Don't think we didn't notice that there. I think the atmosphere is where I can talk about this fight all day. It really is what makes this fight so heartfelt, and even though we all saw it coming, it still lived up to everything it needed to be. Lastly is the difficulty, and I think this is another similar sense as Mr. Negative and Kraven, so I gave it an 8 out of 10. Peter's abilities can be extremely difficult to get the timing right, but not too frustrating to deal with. He's also just very aggressive, and you really need to be on the defensive and also using those Venom attacks whenever you can to get an opening. It's not the fight that gave me the most struggle by any means, but it was definitely a ramp up and a very balanced, difficult fight. Overall, this fight ends up at a 9 out of 10 for me, and I do feel a lot of you will agree with me that the Peter and Miles fight is the best boss in Marvel's Spider-Man 2. But if you don't, that's okay, but please let me know what your favorite fight in this game was in the comment section below.
What do we do now? What do you mean? Now we can finally play the game.
So there it is, our official ranking of the bosses in Marvel Spider-Man 2. I know this is a step away from Kingdom Hearts, but I do want to do a variety of gaming content here, so I hope you guys enjoyed this small segue. And hopefully this can be a reoccurrence, as I do have plenty of other Spider-Man 2 ideas to share. From the Mysterio to the Peter fight, every single fight in this game deserves great merits. I genuinely don't think there is a single bad one in this game, but a ranking is always fun to do regardless. With that said, I'm going to end the video here, guys. Be sure to like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this, and as always, I greatly appreciate the support. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in the next one. Get jiggy and stay awesome.